How you do? And welcome to the very first episode of the Full Movie Offcast, which is my response to the Full Movie Podcast episodes. If you know me from Real Life Ghost Stories, if you know me from 50p Movie Club, you will know that I love movies. That is one of the things I'm into. You can see from behind me that I collect Blu-rays and stuff like that. And ever since Freya and Matt started the Full Movie Podcast, I have been meaning to use those podcasts as a tool to sit down and revisit some of the movies that I love and that I own, and some movies that I don't own but I really need to see. So instead of just sitting down and doing that on my own, I thought, hey, why not share with the world my opinion on these things? Because I know that all of you really want to know what I think about these movies, because why wouldn't you? I am going to really try not to talk too much about the details of this film. I will leave that to Matt and Freya. So if you want to find out a little bit more about the plot of this story and about what goes on, then I suggest you listen to episode 1 of the Full Movie Podcast, where those guys give a really good, succinct rundown of it. But what I am going to say is, because I'm talking about the aspects of this movie that I enjoyed, this video is going to be absolutely full of spoilers. So if you haven't seen The Princess Bride and you want to watch it, may I suggest you go and watch it now and then come back to this video after, or go and watch it now, and even better, then go and listen to the Full Movie Podcast episode and then come back and finish this video. In preparation for me talking about this movie, as I've already said, I've listened to the Full Movie Podcast episode, but I've also listened to an episode of a podcast called The Rewatchables, which is a huge podcast run by Bill Simmons and the Ringer Group, where they go back and they talk about other films as well, similar to what Matt and Freya do, but not as well as Matt and Freya. Matt and Freya do it much better, and theirs is much shorter. The Rewatchables tends to go on and on and on. Thankfully, the Princess Bride one is only 47 minutes long. But I also, if you want to explore this movie a little bit more, then maybe go and listen to that after you've listened to the Full Movie Podcast. So I watched this video on Blu-ray, surprise, surprise. So this has come straight from my collection, not that shelf, but the shelf that's over there. This is the 25th anniversary Blu-ray edition. I think there's an even better version out now, and it may have even been released on 4K. So if you have got a 4K player and you want to see this film, then I'd recommend going out and trying to find the 4K version, just so you can be all fancy. If you haven't, then this is a really good version of it to track down. I'd imagine it's probably within the £6 to £9 range on Amazon at the moment. It has only got one disc, but the disc is full of special features. So if you're like me, you enjoy your movies, this has got tons of extra stuff to sort of give you a bit more context about the process and all that kind of thing. What I really liked about this is two things about these special features. Two specific things. There's lots of good things about it, but the two things I want to talk about. Firstly is that it has a really good sit-down conversation with Robin Wright, Kerry Elwes, and Rob Rayner. So that's the guy that plays Wesley, the guy that plays the lady that plays Buttercup, and the director who also directed Spinal Tap, which I learnt from Matt. The conversation with them was filmed in 2012. So it was coming up to the 25th anniversary of the movie, and it's a really fascinating insight into the sort of how much it means to other people and how their life has changed since the film has come out. And it's incredible to see how insanely good looking Kerry Elwes and Robin Wright still are, even 25 years later. The other thing that I really like about this Blu-ray is that it's got the original 1987 featurettes on it. So it's got a making of featurette, and it's also got a diary from Kerry Elwes about backstage and the filming process and stuff like that. And those featurettes are really niche and like nice to watch. But there's a whole host of stuff on there. Like, I'd say there's probably at least another hour and a half, maybe even longer, maybe even 2 hours of extra bonus content on it. So well worth tracking down if you want a physical media version of it. Otherwise, it's probably on some streaming service. So, The Princess Bride. Fencing, fighting, torture, revenge, giants, monsters, escapes, true love, and miracles. Freya, I tried to memorise that from what you said at the start of it, but I couldn't. I've clearly got it written down at my feet, hence why I'm looking down. This is how Freya starts the episode of Full Movie Podcast, and it's also how the grandfather describes the story of the Princess Bride to his grandson to make it sound amazing, and it is amazing. This film is so good. I'd like to say it's underrated, but it's really not, because it's got such a massive cult following. But what is really interesting about this film is that I had never seen it until my mid-20s. I think part of the reason was for that is because it actually didn't do amazingly well upon release, and it's kind of just built up this really sort of cult following since the VHS was launched, and so people could watch it at home, and people started to sort of pass it around, and it almost failed in the cinema. In fact, it was that bad, according to what I watched. I haven't seen any figures or anything, but that seems to be the gist. But it just completely passed me by. And then when I was in my mid-20s, I was talking a group of friends, and one of them was just ranting and raving about how good this film was, and I was like, what are you talking about? I've never heard of it. And she was describing it as this fairy tale, this satirical fairy tale, and I was just like, oh man, that sounds really lame. And then she said the key word that pulled me in. She said, oh yeah, and it's got that wrestling guy in it, the really big one. And I was like, what, Big Show? And she was like, no, Andre the Giant. And I was like, oh my word, Andre the Giant is in it. So obviously that drew me to watch it, being a massive wrestling geek. And I watched it, and I was like, where has this film been all my life? It's so good for what it is. If you take the satire of Spinal Tap and you mix it in with a sort of fairy tale, smush them together, that is what you get. There's so much good characterization in this film. It's really funny, but it's actually a really cool fairy tale as well. And I just cannot recommend it enough. Like I've said, I don't want to go into the details of the story, but I'm going to talk about favourite scenes simply because Freya gives us 3 of her favourite sections of the film. And I kind of want to talk about those. So the first, I'm going to go in reverse order for a reason. So the last scene that Freya gives us is the Max Miracle scene. Miracle Max scene, even, where Wesley is being healed from dying, essentially. So he's nearly dead, or mostly dead, I think is the way they describe it. And it's got a unrecognisable Billy Crystal in it, who does a really good job. Listening to the sort of making of featurette, he based it on his grandmother, which I just thought was amazing. That seems to have been where he got his characterization from, and he's just such a funny character. You definitely need to listen to what Matt says about the filming of that process with Billy Crystal on Full Movie Podcast to understand how funny that is. I agree, it's a great scene. It's not my favourite scene. The other scene that Freya talks about is the Pit of Despair. This is basically what ends up killing Wesley's character, or making him nearly dead. And he's taken by Humperdinck and his crew, and he's attached to this machinery by Christopher Guest's character, whose name I've forgotten. Good research, Dan. The six-fingered guy. And he's attached to this machine, and it essentially sucks the soul out of him. I mean, this scene is good. I appreciate why Freya's identified it as, because Mel Smith is a really good little side character in this, and it's like a tip of the hat to him. But my favourite scene is the other section, comes in the other section that Freya talks about, the first section that Freya talks about on the podcast, where she's talking about these 3 sort of trials that Wesley goes through when he's trying to save Buttercup from her captors. The first one is against Inigo Montoya, I think that's how you say it, who's played by the guy that plays Saul Berenstein in Homeland, incidentally. But he is an awesome character, and a bit more about that later. But the first part of that is a sword fight. That is my favourite scene. That sword fight scene is just perfect. It's got all of the sort of elements of a great swashbuckling battle. There's some really cool, like, athletic stuff in there. There's some comical moments in it. And I just like the fact that actually this is where these two are kind of like on opposite sides at this point. This is actually the start of their friendship, and it's based on a respect of each other's skills, which I really like. And it doesn't end with Wesley killing Inigo, even though he wins the sword fight. The other thing that I really appreciate about this is that I know some of the background because I've watched all the featurettes, and actually both these actors spent a massive amount of time learning how to fence so that it looked authentic. And actually there's a really good bit in one of the making ofs on the Blu-ray where a member of the crew is talking about how much time they spent just learning how to fence properly. It really shows. It really, really shows, because it's so well structured, and you can see that they're really comfortable with the way they use the sword. So there's obviously elements of fight scenes that you can switch out with stuntmen, but there's also elements that you can't. And it's those little subtle elements, like when they're switching hands with the sword, when you realise how comfortable they are with the foils, and it's so good. I love it. And it's just this little microcosm, the forming of a relationship that then comes back around and works advantageously for both of them towards the end of the scene. So that's my favourite scene personally. But obviously that builds into there's 2 other stages to come with that, but I'll let Freya describe those to you. So go and listen to that episode. In terms of characters, it's always fun to talk about favourite characters. I've got a soft spot for Fezzik, simply because it's Andre the Giant, and because it just suits him. This role really suits him, and Matt talks about in the podcast about the frailties the physical frailties that he had when he was filming this, which is just remarkable when you think about this big guy who couldn't even lift a real or a heavier rock, so they had to use like styrofoam, because he was actually, he'd just come off of back surgery at this point, and he was just, starting to fade out of his wrestling career. So if you think WrestleMania 3 was around 86, 87 I want to say, and this started filming just before that, so he's kind of phasing out his sort of wrestling career at this point, his in-ring wrestling career. But he just looks like he's having the best time. It's he just suits the role really well. He is just this big friendly giant, and he's obviously like bigger than anybody else on the set. His hand, there's this brilliant scene where he's reviving Inigo, who's hit the drink pretty hard after feeling that he's failed, and he's got the face of Mandy Patinkin in his hand, and you just see how massive his hand is. And I think it's just that sort of thing where you get, because the film's cleverly shot so that none of the actors always look smaller than him, but it doesn't look in a way where there's this massive contrast all the time. But that particular scene, you really see how big this guy was. So he is one of my favourite characters, but I think it's more for that affiliation to the wrestling more than anything else. My actual favourite character is Inigo Montoya. I just think he is awesome. I agree with Freya in that, yes, he probably deserved to have more film roles after this. He's actually carved out quite a big niche in TV work. But if this is the only thing you're remembered for, what a role to be remembered for. He does that. The Spanish accent is stereotypical to a point, but it never drops at any point. It's consistent all the way through. I remember when the first time I saw it, when I looked up the actor and I worked out who it was, I was like, I can't believe that's the same guy. So he does a really good job, and I just think the narrative that goes with this character all the way through is really interesting. This idea about, he's devoted his whole life to the revenge of the death of his father, and does it actually get him anywhere by the end of the film? That's the question for you to answer when you go and watch it. I'm just going to leave it there. I just want to give, although she's not a character that I particularly relate to, obviously she's central to the story, Buttercup, I do just want to give a massive nod, because obviously, me giving a nod to a Hollywood actor is is better than an Oscar. I just want to give a little tip of the hat to Robin Wright, because her English accent is really good. Considering she is American, it's a very good English accent. It's believable. I was impressed. I was very impressed. Before I go into the kind of the 50p movie style questions that I want to answer, and before I leave you with a little award, I don't know why I'm dancing at this point, I just want to say why I love this film. I think that the main reason I like this is because it is a satirical fairy tale that features a WWE wrestler, and I think that statement in itself is enough to explain why it's a good film. It holds up even 25, 30 years later. Okay, so 30 plus years, it still holds up. You can see that the scenery is, a bit shoddy, a bit, a bit cheaply made, but actually the majority of it is shot really well. It was all shot on location in the Peak District, that sort of area, I believe. And it's just a good family film. And I think, obviously I haven't got kids myself, but I feel like if I sat down and showed this to maybe my nephew or my niece, I think they'd appreciate it for what it is. And I think that is a good sign of a family film, that it goes beyond the generations. There's no sort of elements of CGI in this particularly. the the giant rat-like creatures are a little bit obvious. But then you look at something like Labyrinth, which we'll be talking about later on another episode. If you look at something like that, then obviously the puppets show their age, but again it still holds up. So I just think it's a great family film. There's a couple questions that I ask on 50p Movie Club, which I'm going to ask here. And by ask, I mean rhetorically ask them myself, and then I'm going to answer them because that's what I do. The first one is, would this film be better or worse with The Rock in it? My answer to this question is, I don't think The Rock is needed here. And that's because I don't think this film ever needs to be remade. There are some films that the film lover in me would like to see remade just to see what they did with it. This is one of those films where I'm going to say, leave it alone. Same with Rosemary's Baby, same with The Exorcist. It doesn't need redoing. We're good. The original holds up fine. And I'm going to say the same here. And I don't think The Rock, as good as he is, would bring anything to this that isn't already there. In fact, he probably would make it slightly worse because he's a big guy, but he's not giant big. And then who else do you cast him as? So for me, it's a no on The Rock front. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to scale it on the good movie scale, where 0 is Open House and 10 is the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which is very similar to the scale that Matt and Freya do. But I encourage you to go and listen to how they scale it because it's quite an interesting. The bookends are quite interesting on that one. I am definitely pushing. It's up towards Lord of the Rings range for me. It's a great film. It's not got that epic feel that maybe something like Lord of the Rings has, but in terms of what it's trying to achieve, it does it superbly. I definitely recommend, if you haven't seen it, watch it. There is one more thing I want to do before I go, and I realise I'm probably spoken the same length as the podcast now, which is not what I was intending to do. But there's one more thing I want to do, and I'm actually going to leave this up to you. So if you want to vote on this, I'm going to introduce an award, which I'm going to put into every episode of this that I do. And that award is the Kristen Stewart Award for Best Inanimate Object in a Film. And the nominees are as follows. The first nominee is Fred Savage's character's Commodore 64. Now, you're going to say to me, those of you that have seen this are going to say to me, why have you nominated this as an inanimate object? This doesn't deserve an award. It's fleeting use in the opening scene, and then you never see it again. The reason this has been nominated is because if you look at the broader picture as to what the message behind The Princess Bride is actually about, then if you interpret it in a certain way, the Commodore 64 is actually the true villain of The Princess Bride. I'll let that sink in for a minute. Because the whole point of the grandfather bringing this book to read to his sick grandson is that he wants to show them the old culture, the old ways of doing things. When he was youngster, his TV was a book. That therefore puts the Commodore 64 as the antagonist, as the bad guy. So that is why Fred Savage's character's Commodore 64 is nominated. The second nomination goes to Inigo Montoya's sword. Now, there is a debate around this, whether you can truly class this as inanimate because it does so much movement all the way through. However, it is such an integral part of Montoya's character. It is the first time we see his brilliance is when he's using sword, and it's when they're waiting. There's a brilliant, the opening part of that scene before they fight is when Wesley is climbing up the cliff face and Montoya's waiting for him at the top, and as Vicini goes off, he says to him, "I'm going to fight him left-handed." And then it turns out that actually they're both fighting left-handed, but neither of them are left-handed. That's how good swordsmen they are. But the sword is also crafted by his father, and there's this whole backstory and how it's a link to the father, and it is just an essential object in this film, so it could not be nominated. The final nomination is for Fezzik's Rock. Now, I have spoken. I kind of mentioned it, but Matt speaks about how the rocks are made of polystyrene, I think it is, and they look fake. You can see this from the first. There's a shot where one of them is launched at Wesley's character, and it in flight it looks like a rock, but then it hits an actual boulder behind it, and it kind of bounces in a way that those sponge footballs that you used to have in the playground in primary school. It kind of bounces like one of those, and you're like, I know what's up. And then the next time we see it is held in Fezzik's hands, and I think that's the only weapon we really see Fezzik with during this film. And actually he doesn't even use it, because he uses it as a threat, and he says actually this is another sign of Fezzik's soft side, because actually he's told to hide and then hit Wesley over the head with the rock, and he says, no, I'm not going to do that, we're going to fight like men. And then, as Freya quite rightly tells us, a goddamn sleeper hold that puts him out. But the rock is synonymous with Andre's character. So that is the final nomination. So I'd like you to leave your votes in the comments below. Which inanimate object is going to win the very first Kristen Stewart Award, which might be called the Christies moving forward. But which one is it going to be? Is it going to be the Commodore 64? Is it going to be Inigo Montoya's sword? Or is it going to be Fezzik's rock? I want you to leave your vote below. Thanks very much for watching. If you've got this far, that means I haven't bored you to tears. If you only watched the first 2 minutes, you're not hearing this anyway. I just want to thank you. If you could do the usual YouTube thing, subscribe, set the bell off, because there will be more of these. I kind of want you to watch them. But if you don't want to do that, there's one thing I would like you to do, and that is to subscribe to the Full Movie Podcast, which you can find on all available podcast platforms. But if you're really lazy and you don't want to search, the link is down below in the description for this episode. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time on the Full Movie Offcast.